Thank you for joining us for Shree's Sunday New York Times read-along. We will be starting in just a few minutes with Peter Baker and Susan Glasser. We are live on Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, and YouTube. Please like, please comment, share, retweet, and tag your friends. We are also interested in where you're watching from. Let us know in the comments. Thank you for joining us for Shree's Sunday New York Times read-along. We are excited for today's show. Peter Baker and Susan Glasser are here. And of course, Shree Srinivasan is our host. Peter Baker is the chief White House correspondent for the New York Times, and Susan Glasser is a staff writer at The New Yorker, writing a weekly column about Trump's world. She's also a global affairs analyst at CNN. Shree Srinivasan is the Marshall Loeb Professor at the Stony Brook School of Journalism and co-founder of Digimentors, a digital and virtual events consultancy. Peter and Susan are the authors of a new book on James Baker. We are just so thrilled to have them here. The book is The Man Who Ran Washington: The Life and Times of James A. Baker III. You can follow them on Twitter at Peter Baker NYT and SBG1 for Susan. And now we'll have Shree Srinivasan join us to tell us more about the show.
Hello, everyone. Welcome. We're so delighted to have you all with us. We have two of the busiest reporters in Washington with us today, and we're just delighted that they could spend some time with us. We're going to read the paper, talk about the news, talk about their book, and so much more. There's Neil Parekh, our executive producer. Great to have you here, Neil.
Thank you, Shree.
Let's thank our fabulous team that makes this possible, and let's get going.
Absolutely. We have a great team. Paula Kiger, Steve Taylor, Julia Weeks, and Carla Baranakis. They do a great job helping produce the show every week. Thank you for all of the work you do on Facebook and LinkedIn and in getting us great guests like today's guests, Peter Baker and Susan Glasser. We also want to thank our sponsors, Muck Rack and Strategy Focused Group, for all of their support for the New York Times read-along. If you're interested in being a sponsor, contact Shree or myself at our email addresses. You can see them above. And you can also learn more about our sponsors at these links, readalong.link/muckrack and readalong.link/strategy focused group. And Shree, we have several people.
Lots of people.
Lots of comments.
All over. Yeah,
right.
Great.
Sujana is joining us. Pragna, Patricia, Jonathan Borstein, Eve Botello, Rajni, Linda Lawrence. I'm going to pause here. My mom. Hi, Mom. Thanks for joining us. Doug Levy up early in San Francisco. Always a pleasure to have him join us. And Miriam Berkeley, just a number of people. So please make sure to keep commenting. Let us know where you're watching from. Tag your friends. They're not going to want to miss this show. In addition to Peter Baker and Susan Glasser, we'll be focusing on a special print section in today's paper, Epicenter, how coronavirus impacted 5 neighborhoods in Queens. And then stay after the show, after when we usually end the show at 10 a.m. Eastern time, we'll be doing a special tribute to Betsy Wade, who passed away this week. Betsy Wade was the first female editor at the Times and led the Newspaper Guild. Just an incredible career. our colleague Carla Baranakis will lead an all-star panel to discuss her life and career, the impact she had, not just on the paper and on the union movement, but also women, of course, at the Times. But without further ado, we want to focus on our guests, Peter Baker and Susan Glasser. They are the authors of The Man Who Ran Washington, The Life and Times of James A. Baker III. And you can see some of the reviews from the Wall Street Journal, The Economist, the New York Times, and the Washington Post. So Shri, I'm going to turn it over to you, and let's get this party started.
Thank you very much, Neil. There they are. Hi, folks. Welcome.
Morning.
Good
morning. How are you?
Thank you for being here. We appreciate your. I hear that Peter's not a morning person.
Well, it's not that early.
But it is for a Sunday. But again, thank you very much. We want to first hear from you how you're. Our first question always is, how are you doing during the pandemic, and how's your family? How are you folks managing through all of this?
Well, knock wood. We're very lucky, obviously, not only to be together and safe and not sick and still employed. So, what do we have to complain about?
Thank you. That's certainly one of the considerations with everything that's going on. What we do with this show, for those of you who've joined us, I know we have a lot of new viewers because of Susan and Peter's followers who've joined us. Thank you for being here. Every Sunday, we read the print New York Times out loud. We've been doing this for 5 years now, and we are just so grateful to have this global audience as we talk about the print and news and everything else. First, let's talk about the book that you've written. So, Peter, do you want to start us off a little bit on the book?
Yeah, so this is a biography of James Baker, who was the White House Chief of Staff for Ronald Reagan, Secretary of Treasury, and then Secretary of State under George H.W. Bush at the end of the Cold War. And we spent about 7 years on the book.
Not on purpose.
Not on purpose. It was the first book anybody's written on his whole life, and it's turned out to be a much more interesting story than we even knew going into it. And part of the book is also about Washington and how much Washington has changed, especially in the context of not even just the last 4 years of Donald Trump, but even before that. And I think that Washington is the other big character in the book, and we really thought that it told us something larger about our politics and about our country and where we are today.
When you decided to write this book, what did you know about James Baker that made him unusual and worthy of this, especially at a time when it is so divisive?
Well, it's a good question. Peter and I remembered these events, but we had not covered them really. Right? Baker was sort of this key figure from the end of Watergate to the end of the Cold War, and I think we immediately recognized in his story. Really, because he cuts across politics and policy. And that's something that Peter and I have both done as journalists. And it's not that normal. People here in Washington tend to specialize to a certain extent, right? They do either campaigns and elections, national politics, or they do foreign policy. And because we had been lucky enough to be foreign correspondents for the Washington Post in Moscow, just a decade after the fall of the Soviet Union, I think in particular, we were, thought it would be really a unique opportunity to go back and look at these events that led to the end of the Cold War. And the project really sort of grew from there. But also, it's just an accident that no one had ended up doing a big biography yet of Jim Baker. He is really a very significant figure. Tom Donilon, when we ran into him, he was Barack Obama's former national security advisor. He pointed out that he thought Baker was the most important unelected official since the beginning of the Cold War era. And a couple projects on Baker had fallen through. So it was just sort of an accident in a way. Baker did 2 of his own memoirs, but that no one had done a book on him. It just seemed like a real opportunity to tell a story both about his own remarkable life, but also about, how the world changed. That was one of those hinge points of history moments, really, those years from 1989 to 1992 in particular.
Thank you. Here, Linda Lawrence says, it's in my Amazon basket. So looking forward to this conversation. And everyone, please do get a copy of the book if you can. And you can also tag your friends right now. Please hit share or retweet or tag your friends, and they can watch live or later when they get an opportunity. Carla Baranakis, former national copy chief of the New York Times, says the book is fascinating. It's a great antidote for people who are so done with the current political situation. Thank you. And thank you, Carla, for helping us bring Susan and Peter onto our show this morning. Can you give us a kind of quick sketch of his story? Because there will be a lot of folks here who don't remember or were too young at his peak to kind of understand, as you said, perhaps the most important unelected American official in the entire Cold War era.
Right. Well, in a lot of ways, as soon as he straddled policy and politics, he ran 5 presidential campaigns, really, starting in Gerald Ford in 1976. He was the delegate hunter at the convention. Gerald Ford was the last president, or anybody actually, to face a contested convention. Ronald Reagan was challenging him for the nomination. Baker helped beat him back, and then runs his campaign in the fall. And then from there on, he goes on to run George Bush's campaign in 1980, then Reagan's in 1984, George Bush again in 88 and 92. He also serves as White House chief of staff for Reagan, a man he had run 2 campaigns against, which I think tells you something. And he's considered by many people to be the gold standard of White House chiefs of staff, that he sort of showed the best way to run a White House in a crazy, wild, often partisan Washington. And of course, Secretary of Treasury, he did a lot of things there, including rewriting the entire tax code from top to bottom, negotiating big currency agreement among different states, and then Secretary of State at the end of the Cold War, which by itself would be a book in and of itself, right? Helps reunify Germany, helps bring the Cold War to a peaceful end with the collapse of the Soviet Union, organizes the coalition that fights the Gulf War, the first Gulf War, expels Iraq from Kuwait, and organizes the Madrid Peace Conference, the first time that Israel ever sat down with all of its neighbors. Then, of course, even after leaving office, after the 1992 campaign, when Bush loses to Clinton, Baker comes back in 2000 to help his good friend George Bush's son, George W. Bush, get through the Florida recount, which seems even more relevant today. We can talk about that later if you like. And he's just sort of like a figure who also represents a Washington that worked at times. Not always. It was obviously very partisan back then too. But when the election was over, Baker believed in sitting down with the other side and saying, how can we do things and get things done? Whether fixing Social Security, whether rewriting the tax code, whether ending the war over the Contras in Nicaragua, whether it be with the Soviets to do arms deals, whether it be with the Germans to bring them back together. Baker was a deal maker. He was the real art of the deal. And I think that his story is such that it tells us about how much has changed in Washington.
Thank you. For those of us who are Hamilton fans, we know they have to decide who's going to be Treasury Secretary and who's going to be Secretary of State. What is the history of people who've been both?
Yeah, I can't wait till they make a musical after this.
There's not a lot of history of people who've been both.
No, I mean George Shultz was.
And he was the other for Peter, right? Schultz.
Schultz had run the Labor Department.
That's right.
He had been OMB director, and he was Secretary of Treasury and State.
Right, and so Baker was an acting Commerce Secretary, as he points out. When his very first assignment in Washington, interestingly enough, he didn't come to Washington, by the way, until he was 45. So among many other things, this book is actually also a story about the greatest, most successful mid-career switch probably ever. He comes to Washington at the age of 45 in the Ford administration, because really, think about it, a whole generation of Republicans is sort of wiped out because of this Watergate scandal. And within 1 year, he's risen from being number 2 at the Commerce Department to running the President of the United States campaign for election. Now, he briefly was the acting Commerce Secretary in that period because his boss was elevated initially to run Ford's campaign. So he did that, he did Treasury, and he did State.
Well, thank you, folks. We're talking to Peter Baker and Susan Glasser. Susan is a staff writer for The New Yorker, as well as a CNN Global Affairs analyst. And Peter is chief White House correspondent for The New York Times. Please post your questions. Ask them anything. And I do want to talk more about the book in a little bit, but let's talk about the news of the day with everything happening with the transition. I'd love to hear each of your perspectives on how the transition is going now that we actually have one. And what do you think of some of the picks so far by the Biden administration?
Well, it's a good question. I think what we've seen so far from Biden is what you would expect from him. It's a conventional Democratic team. I like to call this the rise of the deputies committee in Washington. Any administration has a principals committee, which is like cabinet level people, and then you have the deputies committee, the people who are second ranking people in most departments. They usually get together to hash out issues before they ever get to the cabinet. Well, all those people who serve in those number 2 slots, it feels like in the last Obama administration, are suddenly now rising to the next level, up to the cabinet level. So it's a professional group. Biden is obviously looking for a mix of people, liberals and moderates, racial diversity, gender diversity. There's a lot of Democratic constituencies he's trying to satisfy here. Some of them are already unhappy about it, saying you don't have enough of this or more, you need more of that. But I think he's trying to reach out and build a coalition of staffers that is a little like the teams he'd run in the past. A lot of them are people who've been with Biden for a long time. And I think that they're largely on the more moderate side, although obviously there's some key liberals there as well, much like the people he had working for him in the campaign.
And do you think that there will be many who will be able to get through the confirmation process? Where do you see some issues that are going to be a part of the problem?
Well, look, so far, as Peter said, Biden has made some very careful choices. These are people who've been confirmed to positions before, by and large, by the Senate. So, they're certainly start out with the likelihood that they would be. The one nominee so far who's attracted the most kind of public attention and controversy is his nominee for the Director of Office and Management and Budget, Neera Tanden, who runs the liberal think tank, the Center for American Progress. Now, mostly because she's a prolific tweeter, but given the last 4 years in Washington, if prolific tweeting rules you out for a senior government post, that seems unlikely. So in a way, that's a lot of noise. But what is really striking, of course, is here we are in a crazy, crazy situation. You have actually Republican members of the Senate already criticizing Tanden and other Biden nominees without ever having stopped to acknowledge that Joe Biden actually won the election. And, this is obviously the most unprecedented post-election situation of ours or any lifetime since the U.S. was founded. The idea that we're more than a month after the presidential election, more than a month after the election was called, and the president is continuing to say he didn't lose. And even more insanely, the members of his party, at least at the national level, by and large, are agreeing with him. The Washington Post went through the effort of contacting every single Republican member of Congress's office this week, and they came up with a number of only 25 in both the House and Senate, only 25 Republicans who are actually acknowledging Biden's victory. So, it's really hard to talk about the Biden cabinet when we're still in the stage of actually having to litigate reality.
They did get this 27, 2 more after they published the first story.
2 more came
forward, so we now acknowledge.
Who were the 2? That's
a good question, actually. We'll have to look at the paper.
But this is not the way it would have happened under the old ways of doing things in Washington, right?
Yeah, no, obviously there was
any ways of doing it.
There was obviously a recount in 2000, and that took a little while. But there was something there to be litigated because once the machine recount in Florida was done, it was only 300 and some votes apart, and it was only that one state. That one state, would have changed the election either way. Here, you're talking about tens of thousands of votes in 3 states. So, there's nothing close about this election. Biden won by a larger margin than Obama did in 2012 when he beat Mitt Romney. Biden won by a larger margin than Bush did in 2004 when he beat John Kerry. So this is not really a close election. It's not a sweep, obviously. It's not a landslide, but it's a pretty decisive election. So it's not like there's a great deal of real suspense there. It's just the president of the United States is refusing to admit what everybody else knows, which is that he lost.
Sorry, I'm looking for the.
And that's so important that we should let people know and to the way that all went down, and it's still going down. Yesterday, he had a rally in Georgia, and instead of talking about the virus or the biggest crisis of our lifetimes, it was all filled with, lies and things like that. I want to hear a little bit more about where we are looking at as we look at the the new administration. I want to ask Susan especially about Anthony Blinken.
Well, Tony is a great example of what Peter was talking about, the rise of the deputies. And not only was he the number 2 in the State Department at the end of the Obama administration, but he's probably more than anyone else closely associated with Joe Biden throughout Biden's long career in foreign policy. When Biden was the chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee before he became Barack Obama's vice president, he was also very active on foreign policy as vice president, and alongside him that entire time was Tony Blinken. And so I can't think of somebody, Peter and I both first knew him when he worked at the Clinton administration at the National Security Council. And so he's somebody who, has this long experience. He brings, I think, a sort of classic liberal internationalist perspective. Sorry, that's Peter getting Ellie, our dog. It's her Sunday morning too, so she gets to go outside. But I think that, the thing about Biden and foreign policy that's so interesting is that, he could have given that job to, one of the party grandees. Look at how Obama chose to give it to Hillary Clinton, his rival from 2008. And it says something very interesting to me that Biden chose someone who has just been with him forever. He chose not to go with this or that faction inside the Democratic Party. He chose to go with somebody, who would most completely express his own views on foreign policy. And I think that really tells us a lot about the emerging administration. And by the way, it is a huge contrast. I cannot think of a bigger contrast in some ways between Tony Blinken and the man he'll be succeeding, Mike Pompeo. An extremely partisan person who had little to no foreign policy experience before coming to these important positions in the Trump administration. And in fact, his only real experience was demagoguing the Democrats in his short time on Capitol Hill as the sort of one of the main proponents of the Benghazi conspiracy theory, and the idea that somehow Secretary of State Hillary Clinton had was responsible for the deaths of State Department and other U.S. officials in Benghazi, Libya.
And we saw the effect of those attacks during the election of 2016. Let's take a look at the paper and talk about the newspaper and what's in it today. And as we get set, and we'll bring on the New York Times camera, Neil's going to show us what's in the paper. I want to ask both of you about what it's like to see the print New York Times today. What had you thought where we would be with the paper by 2020 if you were looking back? And are you surprised at how robust the print paper still is?
Yeah, I still think that the print paper has so much value, and I'm an old-fashioned guy, I guess, but I love how the paper has adapted and morphed over the years, right, to fit the internet era. It's graphically more interesting. Its mix of stories is more interesting. The types of sections that they're doing these days. I love that we switched from the travel section to the at-home section during COVID because, well, everybody's at home. So let's try to figure out what we can do with readers during this time. And what a evocative picture today I saw on the front of that great section. So I love the print paper. There's still nothing like it in the world. And to see a story that looks really good and interesting on web in print is often such a different experience. You experience the story. You experience the story in a different way, just kind of tactily and visually, and even as a reading experience. I find the print paper still a very different and really terrific way to spend my Sunday morning.
And Susan, how about you?
Well, look, of course I agree. We are really anachronistic in this household, I guess. We still get 3 newspapers, print newspapers every day, the Times, of course, and also the Post and the Wall Street Journal. And, what I would say is that we just interact with a institution like the Times in so many more ways than we did a generation ago. So it's not either or, print or online, but I would say that, we're interacting obviously with the website all the time throughout the day, and then also experiencing the print paper in a different way. And that, I think, particularly continues to serve as a sort of gateway to things that you might not click on in a more utilitarian way as you're encountering the newspaper during the day. But, I agree with you, the robustness and diversity of the print paper, the range of it now, I think, has defied predictions of its earlier demise. And, I think because of this really radical and positive shift in the last few years to a much more robust and hopefully, knock wood, long-term subscription basis for the paper, that makes me feel much more confident that this model, this hybrid model, because that's really what it is, can go on for a much longer period of time. But I love the experimentation that having that subscription revenue has occasioned. Being less dependent on a kind of rigid structure means that you are publishing, in print, special sections all the time. That's fantastic. Imagine, being able to do that 20 years ago when Peter and I were just young journalists. We wouldn't have had that flexibility and showing that readers, are engaged with different ways to come into the paper. So, we Peter and I read the paper differently, of course, and we have different interests. I particularly do like the at-home section, and of course, we love the book review. And to me, that's something that remains much more of a print experience. I would say the other thing is that the Sunday paper, just the range and diversity of it, that being able to take a breath and, read things outside of the news cycle is a privilege at a moment when we've been trapped in this kind of like Twitter treadmill.
Well, thank God for the book reviews. The last one really in the whole country. I mean, there's just nothing like it still. Like, it's so important.
And this week is the holiday books. Look, I just want to also give a shout out to the folks who put out the print Wall Street Journal and the Washington Post. They've also done a lot of innovation in this time. At our house, when we're in New York, we're in Puerto Rico now, so we don't get any of the print papers. But in New York, we get 2, the Journal and the Times, and it's just amazing work that they've been doing. But also a shout out to local newspapers all across the country. Anyone who's watching, wherever you are in the world, please support local journalism. Please invest and make sure that valid, accurate information has a chance to survive against the onslaught of mis and disinformation. So one of the nice things, Peter, is that the New York Times has been doing ads in support of local newspapers. That's something that you would never see otherwise, trying to say good things about their other publication. Patricia says, A Breath of Fresh Air was a cover story in the Times Magazine. Great learning experience about social quantum mechanics of the forest. So there you go. My favorite.
Exactly. Something that an old, a newspaper person might not necessarily think of. But the New York Times is not just a newspaper, which is one of the things that makes it great, right? It is a magazine. It is a wire service online, obviously. It's a compendium of so many different types of writing and journalism, even with fiction every once in a while, and they kind of experiment. And I think that's something here, maybe not, something here for everybody.
And since Susan is at the New Yorker, I just want to hear from her for a moment about how things are going at the magazine, both print and the New Yorker is also very innovative online. So I'd love to hear a little bit about that.
Well, look, I think, one of the things is that, as Peter said, there's a convergence of, everybody is everything right now. So that is both a positive and a challenge, right? And so the New Yorker never would have published the range and volume of things each day that it now does. And, in some ways, it sees a news event and wants to figure out what its right cycle is. But then I'm also working with a fact checker and often not one but two copy editors. So it's slow food done fast sometimes. But it's a great platform, and I think in the last few years, it has really evolved significantly to have a much more robust digital presence, as well as the print magazine. And I think, kind of like the Times, it serves its readers and its audience. And like the Times, it has a real following, right? So it has a robust and growing subscription base. And I hope many of you are subscribers. And if you're not, that you'll think about it, because the way to support this intensive journalism, it means that you can have a print magazine. And I spent a lot of the afternoon yesterday, sitting down reading my colleagues in the print magazine. Is a very different experience than also being able to read, a weekly column like the one that I do, or that my colleague Ben Wallace-Wells writes about politics, or, and I think that is increasingly the future. The problem is it's probably the future for just a handful of, really well-known national brands that give you, a gateway into the whole range of news and ideas. And of course, for the New Yorker, a lot of what it does is arts and culture and books and, just the world of ideas. But, it has a lot of amazing polymaths. My colleague, I like to say that, it's amazing, Atul Gawande, who of course is the amazing physician, writer, thinker, entrepreneur. He's now a member, I guess, of Biden's COVID advisory board, gave a great interview to David Remnick, the editor-in-chief of the magazine, for the New Yorker Radio Hour, which is the wonderful podcast that Remnick hosts. And that's also online this week. I found that to be fantastic. So what is that? Is that the traditional New Yorker big 10,000 word print piece, which of course are still also being published? And I should say to people, because people are probably, I don't know if they're familiar with this or not, but the print New Yorker remains, every single word is, intensively fact checked. You can take this information still to the bank in a day and age of, sort of fake news and not knowing what you believe on the internet. I think that there's such a value to that work, although I must admit that at times it can still feel like, anachronistic. Like I used to joke when I was the editor-in-chief of Foreign Policy magazine, still putting out a print magazine and a daily online magazine. It's kind of like you have the monks in one room hand illustrating the Bible, and then right next door you've got the printing press and Gutenberg cranking out the copies. We are living in simultaneous media worlds right now, but it's a period of innovation at places like the New Yorker and the Times that as a journalist, it's great to see, knock wood, and it really has been fueled, I think, by a renaissance in subscriptions for these publications and trying to build a more sustainable business model in this digital era. My great fear is, of course, that that's not happening for some key parts of our journalism world, and especially local journalism.
Thank you. Laura says, lifelong New Yorker enthusiast here, and it was great to see parts of the New Yorker on screen. We need to do a New Yorker read along soon. Also, it was nice to see, Susan, your story was in the top 3 pieces this week in the New Yorker, and the most popular or the most read. Can you talk about that particular piece? You make the point that we're letting Trump slide, right? That's part of your thesis.
Well, I think one of the challenges that I was trying to write about this week is, there's this understandable desire to sort of move on, right? The election is over. Why give Trump more oxygen? That's what he so clearly craves, more attention for his clearly untrue and baseless claims about the election. At this point, all of the key battleground states have certified their election results. And so, on the one hand, there's this tension, right? Why give him attention? On the other hand, that 46-minute straight to Facebook video speech that he released, is probably, in my view, going to go down in history as one of the most appalling and alarming speeches ever given by a president of the United States. And so, I was just writing about the tension between these two things. I see my weekly letter from Washington. I really try to make it a letter and to try to capture, kind of the range and the ups and downs, right? So it's not just written in one news cycle, because frankly, those news cycles come and go very quickly in Washington, but trying to look at the arc of a particular week. And I think that, that's what I was trying to capture is this frustration. Believe me, like everybody else, I would love to just move on and write about Tony Blinken and, the Senate confirmations and the other things. But when I think about what's history going to remember from this period, and it seems pretty clear to me that what history is going to remember is the president of the United States attacking the very foundations of our democracy with outrageous and sensational claims. He actually is continuing to tell people in what he called the most important speech he's ever given. He's continuing to make a fantastical story that somehow there was a conspiracy involving millions of American votes, multiple American states, Republican officials in those states, and Hugo Chavez, the dead dictator of Venezuela, and a bunch of voting machines. What are we supposed to do with this? We can't just avert our gaze and politely move on, sadly, as much as we'd like to.
And that's the long dead dictator of Venezuela, who wasn't organized enough to take care of his own country. There he was allegedly conspiring for years down the road with America. We're looking at your whole archive here in the New Yorker, and we're seeing that. All right, we have lots of questions and comments coming in, folks. You're watching a conversation with Susan Glasser, staff writer at the New Yorker and CNN global analyst, as well as Peter Baker, who is the chief White House correspondent of the New York Times. Peter, what happened? Yeah, let's just show everybody. Also, your Twitter handles. They're both fabulous on Twitter, so please follow them at Peter Baker NYT, at SBG1, sort of like RBG. I like that. And please do follow both of them. Peter, let me ask you, what happens? Is there a transition at the New York Times when there's a transition at the White House? What happens now?
Yeah, we're refusing to concede. We're not we're not switching yet. There will be some reorganization. Obviously, some people will move on. Some people will stay. My plan is to stay at the White House. I'm looking forward to covering the next administration. It'll be my 5th president. But we're still in discussion about who wants to do what, and we've got a great, amazing team of White House correspondents that have been in the trenches with me these last 4 years, especially. It hasn't always been easy, obviously, under attack as enemies of the people and all of that. It's been quite a stressful time, but that's been our job, and that's been what we have, we're paid to do. And I want to mention my colleagues, Mike Shear, Maggie Haberman, Katie Rogers, Andy Carney, Michael Crowley. What a great team, because they have been fantastic to work with. And we're currently thinking about how we're going to structure ourselves for the next administration come January 20th.
Do you worry that the no drama Obama administration style will come here as well, and therefore you'll have less drama to report on and fewer leaks and things like that?
Well, look, I mean, yeah, as a journalist, obviously you want to, you go for the story, right? And the story of the last 4 years has been this kind of wild roller coaster we've been on. And Biden obviously is promising to not only is inherently less dramatic and bombastic. That's the heart of his appeal. That's what he promised the American people. I think that's why he got 80+ million votes, because people were kind of exhausted for these last 4 years. And they're looking for a little more normalcy and calm. But there'll still be a lot of really important, interesting, important stories. I mean, this is going to be a vital period. And among other things, like what's going to happen in terms of, if there is a Republican Senate, if the Republicans hold on to at least one of these 2 seats in Georgia in next month's runoff, how will Biden work with an opposition Senate? He'll be the first Democratic president coming in with a Republican Senate, I think in more than a century, I think is the number. How is he going to do that? He fashions himself a deal maker. Will there be deals? there's, the question of accountability on the Trump administration outgoing. Will there be investigations going on, and what will Biden do about that? That's a big question for him. A lot of people will put pressure on him one way or the other. I think the other thing to watch for, of course, is his own coalition. Will he hold them together or not? The one thing that he promised that knitted everybody together who voted for him was, I'm not Donald Trump, right? I mean, the one thing everybody who voted for him agreed with is they wanted to get rid of Donald Trump, but they don't agree on a lot of other things. And so you're already beginning to see, even now, the fractures and hair split lines inside his coalition that may grow larger over time as the liberals press for a more aggressive and ambitious program on healthcare and climate change and issues like that. And Biden's more moderate team pushes back and says, well, we don't think this is realistic, or we'd like to take it slower, or whatever they say. This is going to be a really super important, very consequential period. So I think there's a lot of good journalism to be done.
I'm glad to hear that, because we certainly want to continue to see that robust coverage. Can I ask each of you about Kamala Harris? How do you see her role being different from not just Mike Pence, but from previous vice presidents?
That is a good question, and we haven't heard that much about it yet. I'm very interested in this. She's very popular with the Democratic base. In fact, one of the interesting things, if you go back and look at the campaign, was how much, when she was selected, that's when Biden's online fundraising really took off. There was a real sense, perhaps, that he had picked a team that was going to go the distance, that he had not, maybe it was a collective, sort of exhale, like, okay, this can really happen. I'm not sure, but she proved to be very popular with the Democratic donor base, seemed to have been an electoral asset for him on the ticket. But it's less clear, aside from the politics, what her substantive role is going to be. So far, they have been very disciplined. We have not heard a lot of the, kind of leaks coming out of their operation. I think that's where the pandemic also, frankly, has come into play. Reporters are covering this transition at much more of a hands-off distance. They don't have the, kind of free and easy access to individuals and staff that they would normally if it weren't so restricted how people are operating in this coronavirus moment. But, Harris doesn't bring the long decades of experience. Obama selected Biden as vice president for a very different reason, right? Which was to show his credibility on things like foreign policy. Biden at that time was the chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, whereas Harris is coming into the job as a first-term senator from California. She obviously has a big background in law and order as a prosecutor and attorney general in California. So perhaps those are issues she's going to be involved with. But I think that's one of the interesting questions, especially because Biden's selection of her makes her the odds-on favorite to be the leading member of the next generation of Democratic politicians, and perhaps the favorite to succeed him at a time when there were so many people in that crowded Democratic primary race. And so the very thinly veiled subtext of all this is the race to succeed Biden and to become the next Democratic president.
Yeah, and look, every vice presidential team is a forced marriage and an arranged marriage between two people who not necessarily like best of friends or longtime allies. I mean, Obama and Biden were not longtime allies. Trump didn't even know who Mike Pence was probably when he started running for president. So they are often fraught relationships. And what was interesting about Bush and Obama in particular is they picked people who were not seen as running to succeed them, right? Biden ultimately did run 4 years after Obama left office, but when he was picked, people thought this was going to be the last job of his career. Dick Cheney specifically said he wasn't going to run for president. And that created what both those presidents thought was a White House that was not consumed with ambition for the next presidency. This one will be, and particularly because Biden's called himself a transition figure, and everybody assumes, although he hasn't said it, I think, as explicitly as this, that he wouldn't run again in 4 years. We're already going to then see from the very beginning a White House that will be torn between the imperatives of the incumbent president who wants to get things done and the imperatives of the vice president who wants to be the next president.
And can you also mention what you plan to do for covering the First Lady? How does that work in terms of, do you have specific correspondents who will be assigned to, or a team assigned to the First Lady as well as the Vice President, or do you all cover it together? I'm not clear on how that works.
Yeah, it depends, honestly. We've done it in different ways. When Michelle Obama was the first lady, we had Rachel Swarns cover her for the first year or two pretty intensely, because we thought that was such a remarkable moment, right? To have the first African-American first lady in the White House. We wanted to give it the due attention, and Rachel did a fantastic job, although it was really difficult because the Michelle Obama operation was not very transparent, let's say. But, you know, we don't do that every time. It depends on the first lady, depends on how active she is. And we'll see about the second gentleman and how active he is as he sort of blazes his own trail in effect. So we don't really, we haven't decided yet. We often have one correspondent who's sort of more focused on that office, that part of the White House, than others, but it's usually not a separate beat.
Well, and Jill Biden is a very interesting figure. She's certainly, first of all, an enormous contrast with Melania Trump, obviously, but in particular because she's planning to continue to work and to be a community college professor still. And so that will be sort of breaking ground in a way that's different than her predecessors. You know, Hillary Clinton obviously had an enormous and robust professional career, but when she came into the White House, it was the early 1990s, and she worked in her husband's administration, in effect, on the sort of doomed healthcare project initially, but she didn't continue her law practice.
I wonder if a lot of reporters have to go back to school. Send them back.
Take her class, maybe is it an online class?
I don't know. It's a good question. Yeah.
And folks, we are talking to Peter Baker and Susan Glasser. What a great conversation. We're all learning so much. We are grateful to everyone who's watching. Please hit share so your friends and family can watch live or later. Look at what Pradnya just did. Pradnya tagged a whole bunch of her friends, and everyone should do this. Just in your Facebook or on Twitter or on LinkedIn, just tag a bunch of friends and they can watch, because right after we're off the air, it'll rerun right here. So let's bring the New York Times camera back and look at what's on the front page and the kind of covers of the various sections. We have so many things to cover, and we've only really talked about the transition and about the president. Let's see what's on the front page. Neil's going to give us a little tour, and let's take a look. One of the things that our international audience may not be used to, in many countries, the lead story is not on the upper right the way it is in most American newspapers. And Peter, what does it feel like to have a story there versus anywhere else on the page?
Well, it's interesting. It's changed over the years. You know, the old way of doing things, as I grew up, was that story you're looking at right now had to be a hard news story. It had to be something happened, boom, boom, right? It could be an investigative, but it had to have a hard news lead. These days we're a lot more flexible. These days you can have a news analysis in that slot. You can have something that has more of a story that kind of backs into its subject a little bit. That the old format, the old rules are kind of being reinvented here as we reinvent the print paper.
And there's your byline. I haven't seen this story yet. The last act of the Trump drama: rage, denial, and what's the last word? And
retribution.
What I didn't understand, Peter, is he's appointing people for just like to that Pentagon overseer board, like for just a few weeks. What is the point of that? Just to cause trouble, right?
He's just appointing them for his second term. He's just getting ready for the next 4 years. No, I think, look, some of these appointments are about, resume enhancement, right? Giving people something that they would like to brag about in later life. Some of it's maybe about putting in some last-minute policy changes, trying to lock in things before they leave office. Some of it may be about replacing people who have angered other people, right? This is a chance to take a pound of flesh from different parts of the government that have angered the president or angered people around the president. Some of these may be things that he's not personally even involved with, but people around him are taking advantage of the moment. That happens too. But you're right, he has not stopped in these last 70 days between the election and the inauguration day of putting in a lot of appointments and firing people as he sees fit.
Naomi says
Peter,
program, wonderful guests shared with friends, including Tim G. Anderson, a former New York Times editor. And folks, we want to remind everyone that at 10 a.m. Eastern, in about 35 minutes or so, we're going to do a tribute to Betsy Wade, one of the pioneering women at the New York Times. She passed away this week, and we're going to have some of her colleagues and friends join us for an informal tribute that we will be doing. So please stay tuned for that. Neil, anything you want to show us?
Peter, if you don't mind, just a quick question. Your piece that's on A1 today, it's described as a White House memo. For our viewers, can you explain what that means? What does that signal to the reader in terms of the content or the approach of the article?
Well, it's meant to say that this is, we're kind of stepping back a little bit here. It's not going to be that hard news story we just talked about. It's not going to be blank happened yesterday. It's meant to be sort of more of a slice of something from inside the White House. Look, it can be analytical, it can be a colorful feature, it can be atmospheric. The idea is meant to say, okay, from those of us who are inside the bubble, in effect, here's how things look. And in today's piece, we're trying to look at Trump's final days and this sort of like Shakespearean quality of the king in the palace, lashing out at his enemies and angry at his fate and denying the reality around him and forcing others to deny the reality around them as well. And so I did something I hadn't done with too many articles in the past. I actually quoted a Shakespeare scholar, which is not the usual source for a White House story, but it actually seemed to fit in this case. In this case, Jeffrey Wilson from Harvard actually wrote a book called Shakespeare and Trump. So it actually seemed to be appropriate, and he was very smart and thoughtful about his analysis.
We were told that we need to ask you about Shakespeare. Yeah.
Well, there are a few references in here because, Jeffrey Wilson says basically what we're seeing now is sort of like classic Act 5 behavior. At the sort of the tail end of the play when the monarch is surrounded by enemies and lashing out, and that's sort of the quality. For the first 3 to 4 weeks after the election, we almost never saw the president. He was in seclusion. He cleared out his public schedule. He wasn't talking until the rally last night. We hadn't seen him give an extended public appearance. And when he did talk, it was through Twitter, and it was this sort of angry bursts of grievance and false claims. And I think that we were trying to sort of take the reader inside this period of this particular presidency as it's facing its end in a stew of resentment and fantasy.
So you got the word rage in there. She got the word crazy in her headline. Susan did, or at least the editors did. In as we try to understand, make sense of these last few weeks, as you were saying. I just want to put up this comment from Ron Thomas, who's one of our sponsors and a former guest himself. Greetings from Dubai. Love your interviews on television. So you're both on TV a lot. We'll want to ask Susan about that especially, and great guests. So Susan, can you talk a little bit about your TV work, the CNN work, and how does that fit in with what you're doing at the New Yorker, et cetera?
Well, it's interesting, but neither Peter nor I really up until this year had been really all that spending that much time until the Trump era on television. We both had, been guests on various shows. And, obviously television has had to pivot to try to narrate and explain this most disruptive presidency to its viewers as well. And so it's not really something I ever expected to be doing, I must say. But, it feels like having spent most of my career here in Washington, except for the time, the 4 years when Peter and I were based overseas in Russia and the former Soviet Union, and then a brief stint in the Middle East after 2016, this Washington is at an inflection point at a moment that's so different than what preceded it. And I guess, now that we're old, both Peter and I have the ability to offer some context for people. Here's how, and in a way, that's how it brings it back to our book about Jim Baker as well. I think what we're both trying to do is to offer people a sense of How have these institutions functioned or not functioned in the past? What is really disruptive about the Trump presidency versus something you might see in any Republican administration, a particularly partisan one, perhaps. And so trying, to give people a sense of, what's signal and what's noise at this very, very noisy time in our public space. But yeah, right now, of course, we're doing this TV sitting in our living room, which we've turned into a sort of de facto studio in the midst of the pandemic. We're no longer going to CNN in my case, or to MSNBC in Peter's case. We are just, taking our laptops and, we have one of these kitchen stools behind us, and we bring it into the living room and, put it up on a stack of books. And, there's this room raider guy on Twitter that everybody cares about, and so we had to move around the house the first few weeks of the pandemic to find the right place. So because poor Peter was doing it in his office, and he kept getting savaged by the room raider, by the various viewers who didn't like, the back of the closet door and all this. So we now have gotten a good rating. We're just sticking with the living room. We're doing something different in the kitchen this morning, just because it's Sunday morning. But it's a weird time to be doing anything when it comes to journalism and Washington. And it does feel like the one positive thing I would say for journalists, whether you're on television or in print or both, in the last few years of the Trump era, is that it has been a kind of mission clarifying moment, right? That this is really a reminder in some ways to back to first principles, a sense of if you want to understand why journalism matters, I can't think of a more bracing time when the value of independent reporting, speaking truth to power, and being able to do investigative reporting, it really matters.
Folks, this just happened. Look at this breaking news. You just got raided by a room raider.
Yeah, well, this room has been raided before too.
You were just like you were inviting him. You were saying,
But it's a 10 out of 10, and that's the.
No, we have been raided in this room before too. We are big fans, I should say, of the room raider. But
big fans, yes.
Yeah, it's one of those cultural moments. I guess we'll look back on it and we'll be like, this summer we were at my parents' house in Massachusetts for a while during the pandemic. And I must tell you that my father is extremely delighted that the kitchen of their house in Massachusetts has been highly regarded by the room raider. I kept explaining to him I didn't think this was going to have long-term implications for the value of their house. But my dad is a very proud father when it comes to.
I'm sure if he ever has to sell the house, he'll put that in the.
Well, honestly, he's already brought that up. I told him that I didn't think that.
Well, this is new for us because we rarely get to talk about the room ratings. We've had so many of our guests rated, but not like this. And I'm sure on CNN, you're not talking about Trump and room rating. This is the specialty of the New York Times.
We're trying to give you the behind-the-scenes view of what it's like to be a journalist in this moment in time. And the real uncanny truth of it is that we are sitting here like your viewers. We're sitting at home and avoiding the pandemic. I mean, many days our car is not used. We're in contact with our sources on Zoom and, email and telephone, just like the rest of people doing their work from home. And so that's just one of the things we're all going to remember about this crazy moment.
Naomi asks, where is the golden retriever? And says, it's ever fascinating how our species is able to adapt when science balances religion.
All right, there's Ellie. Can you see Ellie?
We'll need a close-up there, Neil. Let's take a look. There you go. There she is.
Ellie.
Oh, wow.
Oh, here she
you
goes.
called her.
She's ready for her close-up. Yeah.
Ellie just turned 5 yesterday, and she's actually part Labrador and part Golden Retriever.
Yeah. Our dog turns 5 in a few days herself, so that's sometimes you'll hear her in the back. Marilyn says, we do watch the room on the broadcast, forced me to rethink my broadcast space. Certainly something that we've all kind of
Yeah, everybody has. Whether you're on Zoom calls because of work, or whether you're doing TV or internet programs, everybody's had to sort of think through things that we never really imagined in the past.
Sure. We're going to get back to the paper, but we had an interesting comment here about Russia. And I was thinking about this. Can you tell me what helped you cover Washington, or this Washington, better because you spent time in Moscow? And what do you think will be history's judgment on what exactly Russia's role was in the 2016 election and this administration? Just by background, I was a little kid in the former Soviet Union, and I lived in Moscow. I speak fluent Russian. I'd come home saying Lenin is God, because that's what they teach you. And then I moved to the Upper East Side and started saying John Lennon is God. And
when were you there then? What years?
This was in 77, 74 to 77, the late 70s. So I was, a child of the Soviet Union at that time. My father was an Indian diplomat based there.
How interesting.
Oh,
what
wow.
a fascinating time it must have been to live there. Where did you go to school?
I went to Detski Sad, a Russian kindergarten, and I speak fluent Russian, was a full communist, and knew all the songs and speeches by Lenin. All of that was inculcated into us. And so when we hear that the current administration there is trying to relive the glory days of the expansive union, it's kind of amazing to see that at any time an American president would have anything to do with them. Or if we'll remember kind of one of the low points of American presidency, where in Helsinki, Trump sides with Putin over his own intelligence agencies and all of that. So would love your thoughts on that.
Yeah, Susan was in Helsinki, actually.
Yeah, I was there for CNN live covering Helsinki, and that was really I would say my most dramatic moment of television really ever. And I remember watching that press conference. We were sitting outside. There was a building. It was actually like an outdoor pool building that had been given over to not just CNN, but to the networks, including Fox, to cover Helsinki. And it's sort of like they built studios. They were sitting on a balcony looking outside, and you could see over the harbor in Helsinki to the big yellow building where the actual summit meeting was happening.
Wow, look at that.
Look at that.
That's good research.
All right. And it was really amazing to be sitting there in watching that press conference in real time. And I remember Anderson Cooper was the host, and we all were sort of stunned, like jaws hanging open, listening to Trump endorse Putin's view of the 2016 election. And then afterwards, there's sort of this literally stunned silence on the air. And then Anderson Cooper just says, he just comes out with one of the strongest worded statements I've ever seen from a television host. And he said something like, this was un-American, or, downright, a betrayal. And it seemed shocking to me even that he had said it. But then I realized, he's right, that part of the responsibility at this moment in time is to have the authority and confidence as journalists to call a spade a spade. But, to your question about, we never, ever would have thought that covering Russia and the former Soviet Union would have been a valuable experience in covering Washington. And yet many times, because you and I were based in Moscow, essentially at the key period of Vladimir Putin's rise to power and his consolidation of power, his first few years in office, which was really essentially the dismantling of this imperfect and fragile, but nonetheless democratic small d institutions that had emerged in Russia in the 1990s. And so we watched Putin take over the one independent television network that ever existed in Russia, NTV. We watched, the reimposition of the Soviet era the Stalin era national anthem. We watched the arrest of the biggest businessman in Russia as a warning sign to all the others. And I think that experience, and watching also, by the way, the sort of Moscow political and business elite essentially change their tune and go along with things that would have been unthinkable to them just a few years earlier. And I found that to be a very valuable experience. And I think it's one of the reasons that, regardless of what is the mystery behind Trump and Putin's mutual admiration society, even putting aside that, I just think the experience of watching a democracy be taken over and dismantled, and watching people go along with it was really an uncanny and oddly valuable experience in trying to understand what's been happening in Trump's Washington, and especially in the Republican Party over the last few years.
And this is where the elder statesmen of the Republican Party would be so shocked, right? Because, including Mr. Baker, because they spent their lives kind of fighting the old Soviet Union, and here they are. And so I also want to make a point that it's not just Mr. Trump and what he did, but it's the Republican basically condoning everything by not criticizing him. Just a handful of people, and the fear he's struck in them is quite amazing. And I want to ask Peter a question about looking ahead. Do you really think Trump will hold the party hostage for the next 4 years by just presuming he will want to run? And even if he doesn't run, because he'll be much older then, he will want to have control of the party.
Yeah, it's a great question. Of course, he's already started talking about whether he would run in 2024, even though he hasn't admitted that he lost in 2020. Just the other night, he had a lot of Republicans. Oh, there we are. Hello.
Very
This is Tara, and this is why I had stepped off of camera earlier, trying to get her on here. She's not as camera friendly as Ellie, clearly.
No, she's cute.
Hi, Tara. She's great. Oh my goodness. Look at that. Almost 5.
Yeah.
Well, I hope her birthday is as good as Ellie's was. Oh, there we go.
Thanks for letting me do that. All right, go ahead. Sorry.
Well, it's interesting about Trump, by the way, the one president who didn't have a dog. It's odd. It's dogs are a real long time, denizens of the White House, and we haven't had one in the last 4 years.
My wife blames part of Trump's personality on the fact that he doesn't like dogs, and that tells you something about him. I don't know.
I'll confess, I'm not a big dog person either, but I think that it has been an American tradition anyway to have dogs in the White House. Biden, I think, is planning to bring 2, right? And a cat
now.
And a cat. It will be a real menagerie.
And can you, there were these stories about how he injured his foot and the coverage of that versus the medical coverage of Trump. Any comment on that?
I don't have any great thoughts about that. I mean, obviously we're going to be concerned for the next 4 years about the health of a 78-year-old president. Biden will be the oldest president we've ever had. And so this will be, I think, a perennial subject of stories. I'm assuming just in general, we'll look for his annual checkups and all of that.
Well, there was a lot more transparency in the 1 foot injury. Then we're still waiting to find out what was the deal with that mystery Trump visit to Walter Reed Medical Center last year. The contrast in every way, that I think is going to be the big challenge, especially for Peter and his colleagues in the daily paper, is the extent to which does a return to normalcy, which is what Biden has planned. How do you do that while also recognizing the sort of extreme abnormality of the last few years, and in particular the lack of transparency, this sort of breathtaking pivots that many Republican members have executed. Now, of course, they're going to return to their role of being the opposition to the president, and that's normal in our democracy. But how are we going to write about that and, take into account what they were willing to accept of the president over the last few years? It's going to be a complicated period of time because, mass forgetting about what's just gone on is going to make a lot of people angry too.
Yeah, but I think the other thing is also we're going to be holding the Biden White House to account as well, and the question is going to be interesting in terms of sort of what's the baseline, right?
Yeah.
So our job as reporters is to hold every White House accountable, regardless of party, regardless of president. So as we hold Biden accountable, what is the standard to which he is being judged? Is it the standard that Trump has set, and therefore basically almost anything he does will not be all that norm shattering because Trump shattered all the norms, in which case Biden has a whole lot more latitude to do things that no president had done before Trump? Or do we hold them to the standards that presidents have been held to before Trump? In other words, for instance, on issues like transparency on health, on issues like, releasing your tax returns. He's going to release his tax returns, already has during the campaign. But at what point will this president or our future presidents be able to say, well, I don't have to do this, or I can do that because Trump did much more? And does that mean, therefore, well, he didn't do as much as Trump in this or that, the other thing, therefore it's not that big of a change? Or is it a big change because it's something that no president before Trump would have ever done, but Trump, because he was so more extreme or expansive in this way or that way, makes it seem like, well, this isn't that big a deal by comparison?
Thank you, folks. We're going to just look at a little bit of the New York Times camera here. Neil's going to pull that up here so we can take a look. This is the epicenter special section of the New York Times. Neil, you want to tell us a little more about it, maybe? I'll just unmute you, Neil. 1 second. Go ahead, Neil. You have to unmute. Neil's just going to unmute himself. Let's see. And we are looking at all the other sections here. Let's see if Peter or Susan, you have the issue in front of you. So can you just read that headline if you have that?
The epicenter. As winter turned to spring, the coronavirus hit a corner of Queens harder than almost anywhere else in the United States. Thousands fell ill, hundreds died, and a nation was put on alert. It was here.
Yeah, that's the special 16-page edition of the Epicenter. If anyone just searches Epicenter New York Times, you'll find that, and they have a special online treatment that will just show to everyone. Here's what it looks like. This is here's what she just read, and then look at how it's displayed here online. And Peter, if you have any comments on the way they take your print stories and are able to do this stuff online, I would love to hear those too.
This is a classic example I was talking about at the beginning about how the same story, the same package can look so different and evocative in different ways in print versus online. Right? You can do things online now, obviously, we've never been able to do journalistically, just visually and capturing your attention, and then translate. Usually that's now the first way to look at it, and it's translating into print. That's now the second way. You know what I mean? I don't know how this particular story was put together, but my guess is the first thought they had was, how is it going to look? How are we going to package it online? How are we going to present this to our readers? What can we do is creative and different and exciting online? And then once we've done that, how do you make that work in print, which doesn't have the same obvious, technological bells and whistles that you're allowed, that you can take advantage of in your website? And I think both of them look great in very different ways, and both of them, again, draw in the reader in very different ways. And sometimes I find it easier to read it in print because it's just laid out right in front of you. But there are times I look at it and I say, well, I'd rather read this online, actually, because I do really enjoy the interactive almost nature of it.
Yeah, and I think that's part of what makes this special. So this is called the Epicenter, and I want to take this opportunity also to mention that our friend Mitra Kalita, formerly of CNN, has launched a newsletter called Epicenter-NYC, which is covering the Epicenter. So once you read the New York Times section, if you want to understand how to help folks who are dealing with this, it's two completely different projects, but it's called Epicenter-NYC. .com, and people can take a look at that. So I think they will learn a lot about what is happening with the crisis in New York, and that's what we wanted to see. Let's see what else is on the camera.
Hey, I'm sorry about that. You can hear me now? Great. Sorry about that. And we'll just switch the paper back there. So did you cover the whole section, Sri?
Yeah, we did. We just want to mention that Dan Barry was with Annie Coriel were the authors of this section, and Neil will tell us more about it. Dan was a guest on our show when we paid tribute to Jim Dwyer, so it's just nice to see Dan's work again featured in this special
absolutely
section. Go ahead, Neil.
And the photography as well is in particular. But what I want to do is to point out in particular, if we start with the beginning, it's the lead that was really significant. And I want to give a shout out. The photography is by Todd Heisler, and the Wayne Camadoy, our friend, did the layout in the print edition. But just to focus on the lead, if you didn't have a chance to do that, she wears a red wig and a black dress she sewed herself. It hugs her body as she moves about the stage, lip-syncing love songs in Spanish, to a room filled mostly with absence. It's just incredible, and it's an incredible look at 5 neighborhoods in Queens. There's a map here, if you saw that online, looking at Jackson Heights, East Elmhurst, Woodside, and ironically enough, Corona, one of the neighborhoods in Queens, which is very strange. It looks closely at these 6 portraits of how coronavirus affected their lives and their families. But I mean, it's dated at the top. If you see Friday, March 20th, perfect for contagion. That's what it says on the headline. Just dominant pictures, a lot of white space, which is also good. I've seen more of that in the Times lately, especially in the home section. But then a big spread picture like that, if you can see. This is March 29th. This is when, Todd has been embedded in that sense in Queens, in these neighborhoods for the past 7 months. And this is the result of that work, just in terms of photography and the storytelling. And again, I think, Peter, you made this point earlier when we first started talking about this, the special print sections that the New York Times is doing. In this case, it's also beautiful online, and you saw that, you walked through that in terms of the digital experience. But there's several sections that the Times has done that are print only, which is a great boon to subscribers. So this is the epicenter special section right there. Are there other sections we want to take a look at, Sri, before we...
we've got another few minutes, and then we want to talk about the book one more time. So give us
how about the at home section? I know Susan was mentioning that earlier in a very poignant picture on the cover. Their headline: "We are putting tenderness front and center," and that's obviously someone caring for what I presume would be a parent. They've done a series of folding paper exercises at home.
I love that ad of the guy. This
yeah, we've seen this. Saw this 2 weeks ago.
I don't know if this is the right time to do that, but they're advertising.
It's been 72 years since 2020, and the best thing I remember is our family trip to Kissimmee, Florida. And I know I'm pronouncing that wrong. I remember I got corrected on that last time. Kissimmee? Yeah, I think so. 5 dishes to cook.
Peter and Susan, when we had to drive, when I was a kid, first time to Disney World as a kid, we couldn't afford to fly, and we couldn't afford to stay in Orlando, so we had to stay in the neighboring towns. Yeah.
Susan, what's your favorite part of the at-home section?
I think as Peter said, I like that, there was a quick pivot, and the idea of this, that the newspaper has the flexibility and the ability to recognize sort of the changed moment that we're living in. Believe me, I would like to be traveling. A former foreign correspondent sitting at home and not getting on an airplane since early March. It's really been something in my entire life. I've never been at home this much, but I'm a fan of this, as well as the Wall Street Journal's Sunday off or Saturday off-duty section, and bringing in sort of a sense of that the newspaper is about how we live, as well as the news that happens in Washington or in Tweety Tweak. But the New York Times cooking app and section online is fantastic. It's been a huge driver of the growth of Time subscriptions, and they also do 5 things to cook this week, which is fantastic, and people always get ideas from that. And I like this sort of range and diversity of doing something different each week in the print paper.
And I want to give the explanation for that picture on the cover, and I certainly didn't want to assume anything. This is the picture again that caught our attention. The description will be hard to read for you, but it says, "My mother is my muse and life inspiration. When visiting, I document my mom to glorify and immortalize her existence, capturing moments of our daily tasks. I don't believe elderly people should just fade away. They are holders of our truth and storytellers of our foundations." And then from Mama Sia, "When people approach old age, they usually need support from others. I'm lucky to have 3 daughters who take care of me. One of them is both caring and artistic, her care reflected in this picture. Mothers, please allow your babies to express themselves no matter what society's standards impose." That's and Magdalena Wasinka was the photographer on that.
Thank you. We have just 5 minutes left with our guests. I want to read a couple of the comments here. Rod says, "Great interview, enjoying this live with such celebrated journalists." So thank you, Raj. Naomi says, "Never tire of hearing Jim Dwyer's name." Patricia says, "It must say, although I subscribe to print, sometimes it's easier to read digitally for zoom effects, being that the print is quite small font size." And one of the predictions people have made is that eventually the Times will have to go to bigger print size because their readers, the older readers, will want. They already have a kind of big print size one, but the standard size will have to go up. This is Sunday Business. "The reasons Melinda Gates spends time letting my heart break." There's also the cover. Candace Bergen's on the cover of one of the other sections as well. So there's a lot going on here. While he's doing that, why don't we go back to the book? And again, tell us, if you can, both Susan and Peter, why people should care about Mr. Baker and his legacy at this moment. What can we learn from looking at your book?
Well, first of all, I think obviously he's a giant in American politics and American policy going back now for a couple of generations. Really, he had his hand in almost every major thing that happened between the end of end of Watergate and the end of the Cold War. But I also think he tells a story about Washington and how much has changed, right? Like why things are today, how things used to be. Not to glorify or romanticize the past, because there were certainly ugly moments and polarization and tough politics in the 80s and the 90s, but it was a different era. So Baker, he was a knife fighter when it came to elections, and we tell the stories of the 1988 campaign, Bush versus Dukakis, and of course the 2000 recount. But Baker also believed that when the election was over, the election was over, and it was time to do something with the victory you might have won. That governing mattered. So literally, in 1983, he sits down with the Democrats and he saves Social Security's financial foundation. And in 1986, he sits down with the Democrats and rewrites the entire tax code, top to bottom. 1989, sits down with the Democrats and ends the war in Central America, which had been so consuming for Washington. And it's just so hard to see that happening today, right? And Baker believed, look, yes, he was a conservative, but he actually believed in getting stuff done. So do you get everything you want in a negotiation? No, you don't. But it was worth having, and it was worth making deals. I can't imagine a COVID pandemic when Baker was running Washington, in effect, in which there was an agreement by the parties that there should be a relief bill, and yet 7-8 months would go by without an actual bill, right? We haven't had a COVID relief bill since April. We still don't have a COVID relief bill today. Again, even though both parties agree that there should be one. And usually giving out money is the easiest thing politicians do, not the hardest thing that they do. So they can't even do the easy things right now. If Baker were in charge, there would have been a COVID relief bill almost certainly on the president's desk within weeks, if not days, of when they decided they needed it. And so that's why I think this book is important, because it tells you about what used to be in Washington and where things are today in a lot of ways.
Okay, Susan?
Well, that's right. I think it's not, it's not a celebration of power. It's a study of power. And some of the stories, and certainly like the way in which Jim Baker became a master of Washington and its institutions, some of those have almost universal application, whether you're thinking about how power works in Washington or another world capital. Jim Baker just happened to be a very successful figure outer of how to get to the top and how to stay there. And that is an interesting case study, I think, no matter what. It's the same reason we read stories about LBJ or FDR or any of the others who were masters of Washington in their moment. But it's also, to me, and I think for Peter and I, there was this element of time travel to it, especially because we were working on the book during this parallel period when the obvious dysfunction and gridlock of Washington were becoming harder and harder to ignore. And then the rise of Trump gave, this sort of like almost at times painful counterpoint. And it really helped us, I think, to think about the evolution of the modern Republican Party and how has it ended up in the place that it's ended up. We spent years talking with Secretary Baker about Trump as he rose and seeing both Baker's obvious discomfort with Trump. He told us that he thought he was nuts, that he was crazy. And yet at the same time, his, I was going to say inability, but maybe refusal to fully disavow him. It also helped us to understand how it is that Trump can have retained the votes and the loyalty of so many Republicans, even those who 4 years ago were so uncomfortable with many of his positions. And in that sense, it was helping us to understand this disruptive new phenomenon and what the Republican Party is today in America. As journalists, it's our job to look at things as they are, not as we think they ought to be. And so I found it to be just an absolutely rewarding exercise.
Oh, so great to hear. Just before you leave, one question I have for you. Couples who are getting a chance to work on something together, it's happening because of the pandemic, because they're home. What are your tips for staying friends through a major project like this?
Always have a partner as good as Peter and as thoughtful.
Well, since we can't all do that, so what are the other tips?
Luckily, we're still on speaking terms.
This is our second book. Look, we were lucky. We met in a newsroom. So this is sort of our relationship was founded on both personal and professional shared interests, and we were lucky. We've been doing this together now for 20 years, and it's the great joy of my life. And but yeah, it's not okay. You're stuck in a house together, and maybe you don't always you don't have to work together. But I think that everybody needs to give everybody space. Everybody needs to think about what the other person is feeling and needing in this time of crisis and hardship. And I would never presume to give anybody.
I'm going to be on soon.
Advice, but
sorry.
It's good. We're lucky that I think that we have worked together for so long.
Well, with that, we're going to say goodbye and big thanks to Susan and Peter. Everyone, please follow them, SBG1 and Peter Baker NYT on Twitter. You will learn a lot, I promise you, in addition to the great work they do in their respective publications. We hope you have a great Sunday. We're now going to transition to our celebration of Betsy Wade, one of the pioneering editors at the New York Times. But thank you, Peter, and thank you, Susan. Really, thank you.
Thank you, Sri. It was great to talk with you. Love to share this morning with you.
Have a great day.
Thank you, and please tell your friends to be our guests on future episodes as well.
Good do. All right.
Thank you. And before we bring in Carla Baranakis, who's going, look at this. Could you two be any more brilliant and adorable? So perfect.
The dog is, though.
Perfect. No, the answer is no, they could not. Before we bring in our guest to talk about to celebrate the life of Betsy Wade, I just want to tell you a couple of quick things. Our daily COVID show has become just a show that's once or twice a week. After doing 250 episodes. So our next episode is coming up on Tuesday, and it's about Black media. And Aaron Foley, the director of the Black Media Initiatives and the former chief storyteller of the city of Detroit, will be with us at 9 p.m. Eastern this Tuesday. Please join us. They have launched a map and directory of 300 media outlets that are serving the Black community, and we'll talk about many aspects of that. So please join us. And then This show will go till about 10:15, 10:20 or so, maybe a little later, a.m. today. And then at 11 a.m. Eastern, we will be producing our show called She's on Call. Two surgeons, Dr. Sujana Chandrasekhar, whose comments you've seen throughout the show. She's been watching, dedicated viewer of the read along, and Dr. Marina Kurian, two surgeons, will be hosting their regular show that airs every Sunday at 11 a.m. Eastern. Please follow them on Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, and they have two wonderful guests. They talk more about COVID and so much more. So please tune in at 11 a.m. Eastern on the She's on Call channels. I'm the co-executive producer of that, so I play Neil's role in that particular show. So with that, I'm going to hand this over to Neil, who's going to bring on Carla Baranakis, who is part of our team here on the New York Times Read Along, and is going to help us celebrate the life of Betsy Wade. Neil. You're muted, Neil. Still muted. Let's see. I
There
can
we go.
bring on.
There we go. You can hear me now? Great. Sorry about that. What a great show I was saying with Peter Baker and Susan Glasser and their book about James Baker. What we wanted to do for this second part of the show is really pay tribute to an incredible pioneer at the New York Times, Betsy Wade. So Shri, we'll go ahead and do that. Here is a shot just of the obit, the headline. Betsy Wade, first woman to edit news at the Times, dies at 91. 45-year Times career. She also became the first woman to lead the Newspaper Guild of New York and fought a sex discrimination case against the paper. So I'll go ahead and bring on Carla and the rest of our panel, and Shri will let you go to prepare for She's on Call. So joining us will be Carla Baranakis, Donna Cartwright, Barbara Garson, and Mary Curtis, in addition to Jan Benzel. We have a great group here for you, and we really wanted to have Carla lead this discussion, and just have people share some of their memories and offer some tributes to an incredible woman. Carla, over to you.
Thanks very much, Neil. So I wanted to just first give a quick recap of why Betsy Wade is so important, not only to journalism, but to social activism and to women's advances. She was the first woman to edit news copy for the New York Times. She started at the Times in the 1950s. And to be the first woman anything is really a difficult thing. She became the lead plaintiff in a lawsuit against the New York Times in which women sued the Times for sex discrimination. And that lawsuit led to the Times hiring many more women and providing more opportunities for women. And so this was one of the most significant things that could have happened. In addition, other newspapers looked at the Times and saw what had happened with the Times, and other newspapers also started to give women more opportunities. She was also the first woman to lead the Newspaper Guild of New York, which is the largest labor local of what is now known as the News Guild. At the time, it was called the Newspaper Guild, but this was significant in negotiating contracts with the New York Times and other news organizations in the city. And these were at times when there was a lot of labor strife. There were strikes and other things that went on. And so we'll be hearing a little bit about that. And then I just wanted to read one quote from the obituary because she was excellent at all the work that she did. And the obituary said, she was soon recognized for her cool appraisals of articles and her deft pencil, invisible to readers, but all too apparent to colleagues. as her surgical excisions and repairs save the Times from factual errors and its writers from clumsy sentences, phrases of dubious taste, and embarrassing flaws in grammar, spelling, and syntax. So I'd like to introduce now the people we have coming in who have known her and appreciated her. We have Donna Cartwright, who was hired by Betsy Wade on the foreign desk as a copy editor, and who also worked with Betsy in the union. We have Jan Benzel, who worked with Betsy in the travel section in the later part of Betsy's career, and will be able to tell us about some significant things that Betsy did as a travel writer. We have Mary C. Curtis, who also worked with Betsy at the Times, and then additionally afterward, because Betsy was such a giving person, she worked with Betsy on a number of initiatives, including scholarships for younger people. And Betsy remained very active until just very recently in encouraging all kinds of people. And then we have Barbara Garson, who did not work at the New York Times, but she is a playwright, a journalist, and a social activist who had the pleasure of knowing Betsy as a friend. And I think Barbara might even share with us their inauspicious first meeting. But first, I wanted to go to Donna and see if you could just briefly tell us, how you met Betsy and how you got to know her.
Yeah. Can you hear me?
Uh-huh.
Okay. I was hired by the New York Times as a copy editor in 1977. It was actually Betsy who was chief of the foreign news copy desk at that time who hired me and brought me onto the paper. I was always impressed by how graceful and tactful she was with people in a sometimes rough business.
Okay, thanks. And Jan, how about you? How did you get to know Betsy?
I first met Betsy when I first came to the Times. I arrived in 1983 from the Washington Post, where I had been working in the style department. I got to the Times. I had come to New York because I wanted to be an arts editor, a features editor, as I had been at the Post. But at the Times, you had to go through a sort of an initiation on news desks. So after having filled in for someone in travel as a replacement for someone who was on maternity leave, they sent me down into the lion's den where on the national desk, they needed copy editors because they were going into an election year. So they were, even then, even in 1983, very, very few women, certainly of my generation, in the newsroom. I got to this copy desk, and there was a kind of legendary foul-mouthed guy in charge of the copy desk whose mission seemed to be to make me as uncomfortable and miserable as he possibly could. Betsy was this calm, stable, extremely deft editor on the desk who had enough confidence in her person and her abilities. Of course, by now, the women's suit had happened, that she, in between stories, she would pull out her knitting. She would just calmly knit as she waited for the next story to arrive. She couldn't have been nicer to me. She, without being overt about it, she just gave me a little guidance when I had a question. She she talked to some of the other editors on the desk to make sure that they took me to get some dinner. We were all working nights then. It was just, she was not, she did not do this in any sort of obvious way, but it really meant the world to me. And then later, we'll talk about it later, but in the 90s, we were both in the travel section, and I had the great honor of being her editor there. And Donna was also there in those days.
Yeah, right. Okay, thank you. Mary, how did you get to know Betsy?
Well, it was in the mid 80s when I came to the New York Times, and I had been the arts and entertainment editor at the Baltimore Sun. And so I had some experience, but I had to go on the copy desk in the art section to start, because they did put you, on the copy desk until I did used to fill in on weekends. But I was young and looked younger. And so there were some women, weren't very many minorities at all. And so more than once, someone would come and ask me if I was there as a part of a minority internship program and things like that. So it wasn't exactly welcoming, although, some people were very nice, and I remember everyone. And Betsy would come through in her comfy shoes. I think she was up and traveled by then. And just, she noticed, she knew me. I don't know if she had known I was coming, or she noticed me looking a little bit lost. And she was just very kind to me, and she would initiate conversations. Occasionally we'd have coffee and just make me feel welcome. And she was always, when she ran through or walked through, she would always check in, see if I was okay, if folks were treating me well. And it just meant the world to me, because I was new to the city and obviously the New York Times. And as I said, we'll talk about this later, but at different points in my life, whether it was with the Scholarship Fund or a Journalism and Women's Symposium, which we both were members of, and love to talk a little bit later. We're having our virtual convention this weekend, and there was a tribute last night to Betsy, and I took part in that. Or just personally, if I came to New York to judge the contest, and she would say, "You're not staying in a hotel," that kind of thing. So it seems like she was always that warm, welcoming voice, and that treated me beautifully, and treated me just as a great colleague, even though, of course, she was this very formidable figure.
Thank you, Mary. Barbara, tell us how you met Betsy.
Well,
I think that's an interesting story.
I became friends with Betsy by insulting her, unjustifiably. We were on remember, I'm 20 years old, something like that, in the 70s. So we were invited to speak on a panel about women in journalism. Now, I'm not really a journalist either, but, women who had something in the newspaper sometime. And it was me and Betsy and a very tough-looking war reporter. And every time I would say something, all I knew was Betsy was from the New York Times. So I, the radical, would say, "Of course, you at the New York Times," pointing at Betsy, meaning like, "You at the New York Times will take, 2 years to discover that the CIA helped overthrow Allende?" And then in the next sentence, I would go, "And you at the New York Times who do a labor story without ever telling what the people are earning, blah, blah, blah." There are, blah, blah, blah. So Betsy was the New York Times in that panel. And eventually I got to know her. I think the next time I saw her, I was writing up, covering the suit, the women's suit against the Times, where, of course, Betsy was the lead, not just the lead plaintiff, she was the organizer. And here I was, the person that made her the New York Times. "You at the New York Times, you at the New York Times," when she was the head of the union, which you might say was against the Union Times, the women's suit. But the thing is, the truth is that Betsy, for all that she stood for justice within the New York Times, it's true, she was the New York Times. She loved the paper. She loved to make it right. She loved to do the editing. So in fact, she was the New York Times, and she was the lawsuit against the New York Times on behalf of the women, and she was behalf of the dignity and good treatment of union people. And you and I discussed it, Carla. There was she didn't, we'll talk about it later, but she didn't bring resentments from one of these roles to another. She just dealt with each injustice at the moment.
Yes, definitely. Hold it, I'm getting a little bit of echo here. Hang on. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay. So the lawsuit, of course, is well known, and there is a wonderful book about it called "The Girls in the Balcony." And if anybody can get their hands on that book and read it, I think you'll find it very informative. Donna, you were on the foreign desk at the time that suit was going on, and at the time that whole situation drew to a close. Tell us what happened then.
Well, the suit was settled out of court. There was also a parallel suit by racial minorities, which was also settled out of court at roughly the same time. However, Betsy was widely regarded as the woman most likely to rise to a high position in the news department, to managing editor or whatever. And many people thought that was what was going to happen. But soon after the women's suit was settled, Betsy was abruptly relieved of her position as chief of the foreign news copy desk and moved to a lower ranking position on a different desk. And I was stunned. I was actually appalled. I had really enjoyed working both for Betsy and with Betsy.
And I believe that Betsy was aware when she took on the suit that there would be some kind of a price to pay. Yes. She's made those comments in various speeches and commentaries that she's given before. She doesn't mention it in a bitter way, but just that she was aware that this was not going to be just some kind of lark that she could go on. That this was going to have consequences.
Yes, absolutely.
Right. And then when she got involved with the union, describe a little bit of what her involvement was like there.
Well, it was another situation where she was swimming against the tide. It's from this vantage point, it is not easy to remember how pervasive racism and sexism were in that environment. In the union, she also received a lot of resistance from people who were grumbling about, why are so many women in the, at the top of the slate running for office and so forth. And, she encountered that. That was, a fairly typical thing. It was really hard to overcome the ambient prejudices that were both at the paper and in society more broadly.
Right. So, Jan, from what I've read and heard, one of the things that actually became a great joy for Betsy was working in the travel section. And I know from having occasionally helped out in the travel section that she was not in it for getting a free trip somewhere or for just kind of having fun. She took her work very seriously there. Could you tell us a little bit about her work there and what it was like to be her editor?
I will do that, but I just wanted first to go back to Betsy's history and the motivation, or perhaps the first motivation for her to fight for equal pay for women and equal treatment and advancement of women, was that she had always wanted to be in newspapers all the way back to her childhood. She got a job at a newspaper, the New York Herald Tribune, and Bob McFadden's terrific obit tells a little bit about this. She was fired because she was pregnant. And she would say to me when I got to know her, she said, I was fired because I was pregnant. And when that happens, that sets your politics straight pretty fast. You know where you stand and you know what you need to stand up for. And that I think shaped her life in many ways. Mm-hmm. So there was that. And there's also, at some point, we should talk about Ms. and how Ms. was finally accepted.
Oh, my goodness.
The New York Times.
Well, tell us about that. Go ahead. Tell us about that.
Well, I went back and I was reading one of David Dunlap's historical pieces. There was and Betsy's part in getting Ms. into the paper. I mean, she's given credit for it a lot, but really she worked behind the scenes on that. Barbara, you probably know a lot about this too. Perfect. She was.
What a good picture.
This is Betsy curating an exhibit about women for the Times that I think David Dunlap had something to do with getting involved, getting it set up too. So there was resistance to using Ms. The reason that women and Betsy and many of the rest of us thought the New York Times should adopt Ms. was because we use honorifics, we used Miss and Mrs. back then, which meant that women were identified by their marital status. Well, that didn't seem like what should be happening anymore. Women wanted to be acknowledged for their own lives' contributions. So there was a lot of pressure from outside to change, but there was some obstinacy within the paper. I think this is under Abe Rosenthal's regime. So Betsy, in her persistent way, hammered away. And one of the things Betsy always did with her very good friend, Ursula Mahoney, who was our photo editor in travel, was they would always go to the shareholders meetings. And we came up with the idea. There was a feminist writer whose name I don't remember, but who had been hammering at the Times to change to accept Ms. So Betsy said, well, why don't you buy some shares of stock and go to a stockholders meeting and make this point that the Times should have a committee to make the call of whether Ms. was an accepted usage in discourse in the U.S. And rather than convene that committee, I think the board decided that yes, this is the way we should go. And Ms. was adopted not until 1986 in the style book, but it was adopted. And Gloria Steinem came to the newsroom to celebrate. Anyway, so that was another of Betsy's doings. She worked with people. She didn't try to be a solo pioneer in this regard. She got everybody involved. So sorry, that was quite the digression from what was it like to work with her in travel, but I just wanted to make sure we talked a little bit about that too. She loved travel. She had a column. She was a consumer advocate. She wrote important consumer journalism about safety, passenger safety, traveler safety. She wrote about elder hostels, traveling as a family. I mean, you name it. She was that columnist for 14 years. The editor of the section then was Nancy Newhouse, another female powerhouse at the paper. I think she's on the schedule to be a guest on a future one of these read-alongs. So to be working in travel with both Betsy and Nancy, who had done more for women and women readers, and by and readers generally, for the New York Times was really quite something. I felt very lucky to be there at that time.
And then I wanted to go to Mary and hear a little bit about Betsy's efforts to continue to uplift women and young people and really all kinds of people, even after she left the Times.
Yes, well, as I said, I've been involved in the Journalism and Women Symposium, which is a great organization of women of all ages and experience levels. And Betsy, it's interesting. You talked about her knitting, but she sewed together. She took T-shirts from all of the JAWS conferences and sewed a quilt. And every year the quilt is given to someone who has been having some problems or might need a hug, might need a quilt around them. We did the quilt ceremony yesterday, which really was a tribute to Betsy, and the quilt was given to the Boylan family, to her family to have. And she was always at these conventions or camps, we call them. They were very informal. And she would go up to the young women who were maybe their first time, their fellows there, and make them feel welcome. So she was always just very involved in that. And there's a wonderful interview that Edie Lederer, one of the first women at the AP who was a foreign correspondent, she went to Vietnam, and Linda Deutsch, the AP veteran courts reporter, did with her as a newsmaker, as someone who was a pioneer, and that's available, which is wonderful. And then I was very lucky to serve. I still am on the board, and Betsy is an emerita on the board, the Ann O'Hare McCormick Scholars, which is named after a former Times person. And it gives scholarships to women who have been accepted to, it started off at Columbia Journalism School. Now it's also the Newmark School at CUNY. And it gives, because of course, if you go to these schools, you have to work and be a reporter, and they're very expensive. And every year we would get really wonderful applications from women, and we would meet and go over them and give what we could. We couldn't do full scholarships, but give scholarships. And it was a wonderful experience because she took it very seriously. She always donated quite a bit of money because sometimes we would be short. It's also the Newswomen's Club is a part of this as well, of New York, and they're a supporter. And it was great to see her encouragement. And the group, the board follows up. Susan Shira, formerly of the Times, now at Marshall, is on the board as well. And we would follow up and see the work that these women are doing and push them and advise them. And Betsy was always just a part of that. And so it was great to see her just be enthusiastic about the next generations. And it encouraged me to be a mentor to so many people coming up and an inspiration of the kind of journalism I do. In the intersection of politics, culture, race, on my podcast, having strong women's voices. And so to be involved even after we left the Times and to see her and communicate with her regularly was such a gift and an honor. And there's so many generations of young journalists that we were able to help push, talented women, and to really know we're leaving the profession in great hands of so many people. And as I said, it was an honor. And because of that, we got to know each other a little bit personally. She was very kind to my son. People at the time knew him as a little boy, and she got to know him as a grown man. And she was very kind to him. It was one, we were having lunch, and they were talking about music. And later, she got this huge pile of vintage recordings, Lead Belly and all of these. I thought you might like this. That's just who she was. And but the scholarship was so dear to her heart, and there's one name for her. So it will be continuing, both the scholarship fund at the Journalism and Women's Symposium. She really left her mark throughout the industry in so many ways.
Thank you so much for those great.
Can I just jump in? Can I jump in just
Carla.
one more thing? I just wanted to ask Barbara quickly before we go. Barbara has
I don't want to go,
sense.
Carla. Just so you know, I'm not trying to end it. I want to make sure we read the comments that have come in. So please share what you want to do. But I want to make sure, because we've gotten some great comments.
Cool. I was just going to ask Barbara, one of the other aspects of Betsy is she really did enjoy life. She really enjoyed having fun. And I thought Barbara could speak a little bit to that.
I want to mention, it's not just having fun, but apparently she seemed to have time for everything. And I want to mention the trait that made that possible. You talk fun. We did boating together. She did you know that she and Jim wrote a lot of stuff about the town, the history, did research on the history, and published stuff about the history of their town of Stonington. Every once in a while, I would get something in the mail. Oh, she sent a recording of McBird, my play McBird, because it was a rarity indeed. Or she'd find something in a bookstore and send it to me. Or the boating, we did a lot of boating and stuff. And she was a real sailor, I wasn't. And you wonder, how did you have time for all these things? After all, there's the union, and there's always within a union, there's opposition within the union. So you wonder, and the reason was one trait that she had, she did not have resentments. Resentments take up time. She had a sense of justice. If something was wrong, she was going to set it right, and she would give thought to how to set it right. But there was no time spent on, well, he did, and what they did. In fact, while you mentioned that she said she knew there would be consequences for her action on the women's strike, the women's suit against the Times, she really didn't understand the resentments that people would have against her. Because she only knew the arguments. Oh, yes, you were right. Oh, yes, you were right. And it was ended at that. She didn't know that she had no understanding of the rankling when someone is insulted. In fact, I once asked her about that insult when we first met her, how I could accuse her of every wrongdoing of the New York Times for 200 years. And she didn't remember it. But if she had remembered it, she would only remember it with humor. She could do so much because she did each thing in its own time, for itself, and none of that. It could only be a minute that she was in a bookstore. How she could go to the post office to mail books to me. I want to mention that I think of as sad for books, because I would send her books sometimes too that she might be interested in, usually histories of Maine and odd things, so many odd interests. Well, the last 2 years, let me say, she knew she was dying. She was not accepting books. She was only sending out books. She was clearing her shelves, and that was pretty sad. But even then, I don't think she didn't spend much time or emotional energy on the negative of dying. She just did things.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, she was a remarkable person.
And you also raised the issue she might have been higher in management. I want to say she was so in love with the union and her union activities and the activities for other newspapers that were failing and unions there. I'm not sure Betsy would ever have gone into a position that took her out of the bargaining unit. Ask anybody else. I don't know. I'm not sure on that one.
Barbara, thank you so much for that. Really appreciate that. I want to just remind folks that we're doing a tribute to Betsy Wade with an incredible panel. Donna Cartwright, Jan Benzel, Barbara Gerson, and Mary Curtis, and our own Carla Baradakis has been leading this discussion. I wanted to just share some of the comments that have come in from our viewers, because they've been very profound. Lisa Napoli from Los Angeles, R.I.P. Nan Robertson's book, The Girls in the Balcony, which was referenced earlier, should be required reading for all journalists. It chronicles Wade and others in the landmark sex discrimination suit against the Times. Doug Levy, I'm a proud Newspaper Guild member and former organizer, honorably withdrawn since he hasn't worked in a guild jurisdiction. Thank you for this tribute to Betsy Wade, who blazed a trail for so many women and men in journalism careers. Patricia Freudenberg, what awesome leadership skills for keeping up standards. Naomi Service, Betsy Wade was a pioneer and icon. She paved the way for all of us, journalists and readers alike. The comments go on from Miriam Berkeley, referencing Barbara's Mac Bird, Rose saying that it's an interesting conversation. And I want to bring in also the reference to other unions. My mom is watching from New York. Thank you for presenting this. She remembers seeing Betsy speak at the at 1199 SCIU meetings in New York with Dennis Rivera. Dennis Rivera was her organizer. And to your point, Barbara, my mom was a member of the union, was eventually promoted to management, but kept her union card. She stayed in the union. So that might have been possible. Not sure how the Guild would have handled it, but it would have been great to see that. But I just want to make sure that folks, Rachel Coates as well, sharing how moving it was that she was the Times and she was the union. Just great comments for folks. Carla, great job with this. It really is moving.
And I just want to add, just on a one-to-one basis, sometimes I would run into her in the elevator, and if I might have a stressed out look on my face or something, she would say, just don't let them get you down. And, and then she'd be on her way. But, even those little remarks were really, something that shored me up. So I appreciated that so much.
And I want to also call out Monica. Monica is a friend of the show. She's been on the show several times in the past. Monica, we'd love to have you on again. But she wants to especially thank Jan and Carla, who passed the baton her way. And, sharing again this picture that was part of the obituary. That's Monica Drake over Betsy's right shoulder in the corner. And of course, with her is Rebecca Blumenstein, who is the deputy managing editor, both of them on the masthead today, in no small part due to Betsy's work and trailblazing at the Times. So I want to just make sure we're okay with time. We have this great panel. We want to make sure that we're not holding you too long. If there is more that you'd like to share, please continue. I am not going to cut off this conversation because it's too good and people are appreciating it. But I did want to share those comments and bring in that image again.
Thanks for that, Neil. I was thinking that maybe we could just have one more round for everybody to get one more chance to kind of add one more thing, and then we can let people go on with their Sunday. I really appreciate the time that everyone has spent to come and pay tribute to Betsy. So Donna, what anything else you'd like to add? Maybe that story about her on the strike line. Maybe Donna couldn't hear me. Donna, can you hear me now?
Yeah, yes, I can.
Maybe as a last thing, you'd like to share that story about Betsy on the picket line during the strike.
Oh yes, there's a brief strike at the Times in 1981, and it was touch and go. It was not so clear whether we were going to be able to win what we wanted. But Betsy was on the 44th Street side of the building, sat down in the street in front of a delivery truck to try to persuade the drivers not to cross our picket line. And I was on the other side of the building and I couldn't see actually what happened, but I heard later she was arrested for blocking traffic. And that was the kind of thing that didn't surprise me at all, that Betsy would do that, that she would take that kind of risk.
Okay. And Jan, do you have anything else you'd like to add?
I wanted to thank you all for giving us the chance to do this. One of the real regrettable things about the pandemic is that people aren't able to gather in person for memorial services. And having attended the Zoom memorial service for Jim Dwyer just recently, which was wonderful, but not the same as being able to be with everyone else mourning and missing and celebrating someone. I'm glad we're able to do this for Betsy. I can only imagine what an in-person memorial service for her would be like. And I also wanted to say she did so much for women, but she, like Ruth Bader Ginsburg, did so much for men too. And the comments that have been coming in on both the obituary and on various Facebook feeds have been, there's been just as much chiming in by men who've worked with her and men who appreciate her and men she did kind things for as for women.
Thank you. And Mary, any wrap-up comment from you?
Yes, I just want to bring up the concept of legacy. I think it's something everyone thinks about. What do you leave in the world? What mark do you leave for your years here? And being a part of this discussion, thank you again, Carla, for bringing everyone together. Being a part of the tribute at JAWS, Journalism and Women's Symposium last night, and seeing the warmth, how everyone was just so moved. Knowing that she was involved at the end, helping the Ann O'Hare McCormick Scholars, bringing another school into the group of graduate schools that are going to be giving scholarships to women, which will be something coming up soon. The whole sense of legacy, she just, by living her life the way she did, is just an example and a model of how to leave a mark. And knowing you're affecting the world in so many ways through your interactions with people, it's just, as I said, it's very moving and profound, and it leaves a lesson for me, for all of us, as we are contemplating what we want to leave in this world.
Absolutely. And Barbara, final thoughts from you?
I just stupid that Betsy should die. It's just ridiculous. I don't want it to happen.
Yeah, I agree 100%. Well, thank you so much. And I did want to also mention, because I think I forgot to mention earlier, that Mary C. Curtis is a columnist for Roll Call, and she also has a wonderful podcast called Equal Time with Mary C. Curtis. So I hope everybody will check out her columns and also her podcast. And thank you very much, everyone, for participating in this. You've really, I think we could spend days and days talking about how wonderful Betsy Wade was. But I think that you all gave us a nice little snapshot that we can think about. So appreciate it very much.
Thank you, Carla.
Thank you.
All right. And then I guess, Neil, do you want to wrap up?
Sure, happy to wrap things up and just to remind folks that actually next week's guest on the New York Times Read Along is none other than Nancy Newhouse. So that will be a great follow-up to today's show and to the tribute to Betsy. So again, thank you to everyone for joining us today. Really appreciate you taking the time. Mary, Donna, Jan, Barbara, and Carla for putting this together. Jan, you mentioned the tribute to Jim Dwyer. That was incredibly moving and very touching. And we were very proud to work with the Dwyer family to put that virtual memorial together and to work with both the friends and family to share that moment. It was incredibly moving. So thank you again for joining us, and we'll see you next week for Shree's Sunday New York Times Read Along, and we'll just end again with this shot from the obit. Betsy Wade, first woman to edit news at the Times, dies at 91. If nothing else, and there are a number of people who made this comment, there are people who weren't aware of her legacy, weren't aware of her work, and we've opened their eyes to that and shared her incredible journey with them. So thank you again for joining us.